drifting. Thanks very much for coming for one of at least three talks that Professor Oghougui will be giving here during his all too brief tenure as visiting distinguished professor of international relations and politics with us here at WITS. Some of you may know both his work and more about his intellectual and personal career. He's the kind of person where if you ask for even a brief synopsis of his life story, you would be here all night. So we'll not ask him to do that, but you can, I'm sure, take him out for drinks afterwards and he will be happy to keep you enthralled with that story. For the time being, I'll simply say that he has been a professor of political science and international relations at Johns Hopkins University, one of the most distinguished departments globally, since 1995, is that right? So a long time, almost 2 decades. He is a specialist in theory in international relations and politics. If you don't know the US terrain, that's not necessarily so common, particularly the kind of critical theory that he engages with. So he's the kind of scholar with whom those of us who are interested in having conversations about concepts like sovereignty, but not strictly from the international relations point of view, really enjoy engaging. And today we're going to hear him engaged in a series of really fascinating reflections on the history of the concept of democracy and the way in which it's been deployed in African context. There was a paper that is available. I don't know how many, if any of you have asked for it or received it or read it, but if you would like to, you can certainly access it after the talk. We will be happy to send it on to you. So please do ask for it. So what we're going to do is ask Professor Oghoui to give about a 30-minute talk, assuming, I told him not to assume that the paper is read, so he'll give you some detail about what it's about. The paper is called Remembering Democracy, Anti-Colonial Evocations and Invocations of a Disappearing Norm. And after he talks, we will open it up for what I hope will be a rich and stimulating discussion. So welcome, we are really delighted to have you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I was warned before I came that I'll be coming at the end of the semester. So I do understand that everybody is busy. But I'm glad to be here. This is my first time at WITS and I've had a very enjoyable time. I should also say that I tend to talk a bit fast, and I don't know why, but that's just how I am, and so you can slow me down sometimes. And so I start. The title of my presentation, which is Remembering Democracy, suggests a number of things. One is that democracy as a concept and practice has eluded our collective ability to dismantle modern forms of oppression that are contained in both the sovereign state, the sovereign imperial state, capitalism, of course, and the social forms, institutions, and modern and modes of organization that they have generated. So, and I stand by that. The other thing that it suggests is that the story of democracy is one of the casualties of this lack of ability, collective ability to fully account for the complexity of modern struggles for freedom, particularly around the questions of identity, representation, responsibility, and accountability. And it is my impression that two of the obstacles to that full account of what democracy, the concept of democracy, a full account of the history of democracy, that one or two obstacles to it are a kind of racialization and nationalization of that story of democracy. And tonight I want to talk about a brief moment related to that. And I think a part of what I want to talk about under the rubric of race, obviously, is that there has been, in the context of post-colonial Africa, in particular, but also generally around the world in previously minority regime-led states and etc. A desire to circumscribe, I'm not terribly eloquent tonight, circumscribe democracy and democratic deliberation along very, very narrow axes, and that's one of the stories that is going to emanate from what I want to say today. And so, I suppose that I will not be shocking anybody if I say that democracy emerges in the context of struggles for freedom, and that those struggles are both universal in particular, and that so-called Western democracies had undergone a lot of those struggles, but their struggles do not encompass the human experience, and that other people too have aspired to democracy in certain contexts, and that in the context of Africa, that democracy cannot be narrated only as a national phenomenon because it was never separate, that is one that is separate from the processes of the international order, which obviously, given the context of the colonial context of the coming into being of African states, which was an essentially unjust international order, which sanctioned both colonialism, but also became the context in which we express decolonization. So, what I want to suggest, therefore, is that it's very difficult to understand the struggle for democracy, at least black people for democracy and freedom, without really talking about both the desire to change the nature of the state, the colonial state itself, but along with the colonial state, the international order and the institutional government, the state, and all the instruments of production, distribution, exchanges that prevailed at the time of decolonization, capitalism being one of them, and the modes of consumption and appreciation of life, public and private. And I'm using all this because I actually want to take you to a particular moment of contestation in the post-war era, where Africa, in this instance in the French Empire, fought for greater degree of recognition, greater representativity both at home and international order, which has been narrated, of course, in the context of West Africa as a struggle that took place along the lines of processes of insertion, integration, and assimilation. And of course, if you look at all the narratives in Africa, whether you are talking about the liberatory movement and decolonization in Africa, etc., that narrative is actually the prevailing one, that the whole struggle was one of assimilation, integration, insertion, and separation, etc. And so what I want to say tonight goes slightly against that grain too. And I imagine that some of the questions will be about that. It is not, obviously, it's now generally accepted today, and everybody writes today about the fact that democracy, that the spatial reference of democracy and all political ideas and institutions vary according to epochs. Everybody from Rancière, Carlo Galli, you can just pick your pick, everybody seems to be saying that today. What I want to suggest actually is that though those ideas and assumptions and predicates are now in fashion, they had been both believed, articulated, and practiced after World War II as a manner to correct and to supplant a lot of the inadequacies and insufficiencies of democracy. And that was articulated in a much more poignant way, and obviously the question, the racialization, the idea that the story of democracy is racialized has to do with the fact that those moments have never been fully captured for a number of reasons, to which I'm going to refer, but one of which has to do, obviously, with politics and etc. The way I remember the story of democracy, this story, the way I remember it and the way it's remembered, at least in the archives, begins with World War II. Many people obviously know that World War II had been humiliating in the way that it brought about a moment of humility. What we don't usually talk about is how profoundly humiliating it was, and the degree of humility in the West and what it enabled during World War II. France, in particular, obviously had to suffer the humiliation of being occupied by Nazi Germany, and on top of that being freed by black people, colonial populations. Pardon me?
Sorry.
Oh.
Interjection.
But there are many, many things associated with that moment, both in political thought, but also in politics, about which we talk often, but without making a lot of connections. One of them is that the shock of the war in France, and many moments in it, particularly the Shoah, the deportation of Jews, and obviously the presence of black people on French soil to free the French, etc., had brought about a lot of introspection in France. And I'm not sure to tell you the whole history, but most of you know about movements such as existentialism, right? That there was a mood in France that about an exasperation about the future, about the faith of humanity, of reason, of all of those things. But usually people talk about those moments in French political thought as if it was widely shared. Now what I want to propose is that in fact it was the opposite. That whereas in the West, that mood, and you can see it in Italy, certain variant of phenomenology and etc., which suggested a sort of rethinking of both the purpose of politics but of life itself. But for colonial populations in France, it was actually the opposite. That humiliation, the humiliation of France and the humility that set in France was actually an opportunity for colonial population to be able to speak. So in fact, if you look at French parliamentary institutions and you look at French debate from 1946 until 1950, you just look at the archives, you will see that Africans were much more open about expressing themselves, about commenting on both the state, on democracy, etc., etc. And one of the most interesting moments I like to mention to people is even during the war, right? When France was occupied by Vichy, Vichy issued a decree that anybody who takes weapons against the state was committing treason, that there were many ways in which people approached the idea of having to combat Vichy. Most of it was ideologically stated, but the people who were able to express more coherently the idea that one can oppose the state to free one can destroy the state to save the republic were colonial populations. So at the level of the imaginary, of expressiveness, of how to think about the future, colonial populations had been much freer, and so the mood among the colonizer and the colonizer were actually not the same. That the colonizer had been stopped by the war. 2 wars in 20 years was enough to tell Europe that maybe their ways were wrong, their institutions were inadequate, and etc. But for colonial population, it was actually a moment of emergence. And so I want to talk about that. Because, right? And that moment of exhilaration for the colonial population was actually a moment of equality and democratization. And I cannot tell you enough, if you read colonial archives, how much the French had deferred to Africans, in fact. And if you look, and this is also true, you can check this out, that all of the institutions to defend France, the Republic, whether the Comité de Défense de la République, every single one of them until the very end, the provisional assemblies, provisional governments, and etc., all of this had been formulated by a black man, Félix Eboé, in East Africa before they were taken up by de Gaulle and the Free French, and that he had done this in collaboration with former Africans who had fought World War I. Right? And this too should come to you as a corrective to your historiography. Everybody in African history has said that Africans went to fight for the war because France asked them to go fight the war. Obviously, a lot of people repeat this thing without ever asking themselves which France would have asked Africans to go fight for France. The idea of going to fight to free France because as an abject lesson, right, came from illiterate World War I veterans in Chad. And it did not originate from, de Gaulle was in hiding. There was no French state or no French colonial administration to mobilize Africans at that moment, until much later. The initial movement came from black Africans, illiterate soldiers who had seen World War I, and who had been convinced that maybe it was the time to teach the West a lesson about freedom, that they had betrayed them. The only person in the French establishment who expressed that beautifully, actually, paradoxically, was Pétain. Pétain, in 1940, wrote an essay, wrote to his Minister of Justice, as, if he can have one, but he called it justice, I don't know what, in that context, right? Having a Minister of Justice there was problematic. But he wrote a note which actually, I copied, I scanned it, I have it on my computer. He said in 1918, France was victorious and Africa rebelled. In 1940, France was defeated and Africa came to his rescue. He could not understand what happened there, right? And so the basis of course, this discussion today is the idea fostered among many people that Africans could actually engage in political action without political thought behind it, and that Africans didn't know what the war was about, and that these Africans, very same Africans, would not have had ideas about democracy itself, about peace, about election, right? And so what I want to talk about, I want to talk about these, about how Africans thought about their own concrete experiences both before and after the war, how Africans thought there's a whole generation of Africans I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about just one of them, talked about their knowledge of the world and how they imagined the world, the emergent world to proceed. How they imagine the division, how arbitrary they thought of the division in the international system between nation state and the international order, between subject and society, between citizens and others, and how they wanted to reimagine, in fact, very actively, to reimagine the inside-outside of politics as it was configured in those places, the lines between private and public spheres, and then how they reconcile their own particular concern with the universal concern of building a just world after the war. The man I want to talk about in this context is actually, his name is Gabriel Dabousssier. Gabriel Dabousssier was the son of the only colonial administrator who recognized his children by an African woman and had to resign his position. Because the policy had been that if you had a child by an African woman, you put them in orphanages. They had all these institutional orphanages. But Gabriel Dabousssier's father refused to put his children there because he wanted to own them. And he was actually perversely proud of one fact, which is that their mother, Gabriel Dabousssier and his sister, their mother was a niece of El Hadj Omar Tall, who was a very important figure in West African state building, etc. So these guys were noble, and he didn't imagine himself putting the children of nobility in an orphanage. There's something about his sensibility that targets his sensibility. So Gabriel Dabousssier went to France and went to school in France, and one of his classmates, yes, was François Mitterrand. Now, Gabriel Dabousssier was known in all French colonial archives, you can check that in the National Archives in Paris, he was known as the smartest person who ever sat in that chamber. He could read Marx. If you quoted Marx, Hegel, Kant, whoever you read, if you gave him the edition, he would tell you the page. He was known to have a very, very profound photographic memory. Very, very smart man. But Gabriel Dabousssier claimed to be African. And I think that this is also one of the things that is difficult in African historiography, especially in political theory, to determine what is African and what is not. If you read Hegel, you read Kant, you read all of these people, you understand them, are you really African? And of course, at that level, there are many, many resolutions, and one of them I'm just going to name in passing, which is that for us, in fact, reading Kant, Hegel, and speaking the language of Kant, Hegel, and etc., is simply to use Western theory as a vehicular language, not as a vernacular of it. Because people often think that we either poorly read Hegel and Kant, and etc., or that our renditions are either perverse or inadequate, and etc., but that in many places in Africa, and in this particular context, they were very conscious of the fact that those languages, those concepts were simply vehicular languages. They simply allowed them to express different thought through a language that was accessible to the French. And so, if you can have Italian phenomenology, you can have African ones. So, because they're all really the same text, but to different effect. And so I want to talk about Dabousssier. Dabousssier, and so I want to just talk about a few things he had said about the Republic to come after we dismantled the colonial state. And he had this idea. Gabriel Dabousssier obviously was reacting to a number of things. One was European reconstruction. One was the advent of NATO. One was the idea that the sole purpose of African economies was to provide the raw material for European reconstruction. Because one of the few things we never talk about in Africa, obviously, is that the Marshall Plan was never meant to help we know that the Marshall Plan was meant to rebuild Europe after the war,